Is a government stimulus package for a failing or a depressed or an economy in recession a good thing? There are many who think so, but our special guest doesn't. We're going to meet him right on the other side of this break. We are Star 106.5, and I'm Jeffrey.
Now back to Jeffrey on Star 106.5 FM.
Our special guest, Dr. Robert Murphy is our special guest, has a PhD in economics from New York University, taught at Hillsdale College before working as an analyst at Laffer Associates. Dr. Murphy is in town talking about government stimulus, repeating the mistakes of the Great Depression and what lessons the Bahamas can learn so as to avoid those mistakes. We're very happy to have him here, and we're going to talk to him in full just in a moment. Thanks to Pindotile Enterprises, Seafall, Kalina Imperial, Superwash, KFC, BTC, AID, Family Guardian, John Bull, Wemco Security and Collections, and the Global Tile. Mr. Dr. Murphy is now an economist at the Institute for Energy Research. He is a senior fellow in business and economic studies at the Pacific Research Institute. He is the author of Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism and the newly released The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal. He has published several peer-reviewed articles in economic journals and has written hundreds of pieces for the layperson. Robert Murphy, thank you very much, and welcome to the Bahamas. Welcome to Star 106.5, and good afternoon.
Well, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Thank you very much. Happy this afternoon, Dr. Robert Murphy, who is an economist with the Pacific Research Institute. He is a guest of the Nassau Institute here in the Bahamas. Doctor, it's a pleasure again to welcome you. So good afternoon.
Well, again, thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit about Dr. Robert Murphy, your background, where you studied, what was the basis of your doctoral thesis, and what basically is your economic outlook, thrust, perspective, philosophy.
Well, sure. I got my PhD in economics at New York University. I taught for 3 years at Hillsdale College, which is in Michigan, in the United States. My view, I tend to have a free market view that I think that, generally speaking, capitalism is a successful system that's brought unprecedented wealth to people, and that typically when governments come in and try to fix social problems, usually they end up making things worse, especially in the long run. And so in terms of the present crisis, I think that the housing boom was fueled by the Federal Reserve and other policies, and that now the bust has ensued, and that the government's actually making the recession take longer than it would otherwise have to because of all of their programs.
It is understood sometimes, or thought at least by some persons listening to people like you, think tanks who believe in a free market system, that you don't see any role for government, or so limited a role for government that it is almost non-existent. Is that true?
Well, I think a lot of people of my mindset, they would say that the role of the government is to, enforce property rights, to make sure people obey standard rules, that if they sign contracts with each other, that those things are enforced, as opposed to trying to, engineer certain outcomes. And so I think that's really the main problem, is when the government's come in and they don't like what happens on the market and they try to fix it and they end up changing the rules.
So there's no question that people like you, and just not say people like you, but Dr. Robert Murphy absolutely abhors, totally disagrees with the present stance by the United States government and any other government who acts in that fashion.
Well, right. I mean, because on the face of it, it doesn't really make sense that President Obama has agreed with me and others, not by name, of course, that what happened during the housing boom was Americans consumed too much, that they didn't save because they were misled by their rising home prices and stock portfolios. They should have been saving more. They didn't. And so it was a problem of overconsumption. And so now the way you fix that is people need to save more, but the government is doing the opposite. The government's borrowing more than it's ever borrowed before. So you don't borrow and spend your way out of a problem caused by overspending.
But do you think that there is a place in this economic circumstance, which everybody universally agrees is the worst since the Great Depression, of government potentially stepping in and saving some of the failing institutions that otherwise, if they had not failed them, or if they have not saved them, and if they have not gone in to rescue or to hold the bleeding, things would be much, much, much worse, and many, many more lives would be lost or affected and possibly damaged.
I think there might have been a more severe short-term pain if the government really had just stepped back and let the housing boom collapse and let those financial firms go out of business, the ones that had made the worst bets during the boom. There would have been short-term pain, and probably there would have been a few months there that would have been worse than we have seen. But by now, we would have been over it. I mean, those assets, when a company goes bankrupt, those assets don't disappear. They just get transferred. So the losses from all those bad loans that have been made, those things are still there. It's not that the government made them disappear. All it can do is rearrange them and it's, in effect, make the U.S. taxpayer eat the loss instead of the people who made the decisions.
Yeah. So what the government is doing by trying to save the auto industry, although GM has filed for bankruptcy, only Ford seems to be in somewhat of a decent financial health. Otherwise, they too are going to be going to looking for some kind of protection. What they did and replacing the chief executive officer at GM is just totally wrong.
Well, yeah, I think so because, I mean, for one thing, people have known for years that the big three, that they need to get their act together, and that's not really the extent of automobile production in the U.S. There's plenty of foreign brands that have factories in the United States and southern states, places like South Carolina and others, where they don't have such strong union rules and they can produce cars more cheaply, and they were doing just fine. So, you know, it's a very narrow view, I think, to just look at Detroit and say that's where the heart of car production is in the United States. If those people screw up, then they need to go out of business or they need to get their act together.
But Dr. Murphy, Ben Bernanke, who is the chief of the Federal Reserve, speaking before a subcommittee in Congress earlier this month, Wednesday, June the 3rd, said the following: government intervention to fight the worst financial crisis since the 1930s and lift the U.S. out of the recession was necessary and appropriate. End quote. Don't agree.
Right, I don't agree, and it's ironic. I mean, Ben Bernanke, before he took his current post, his expertise was actually on the Depression, but I think he's misreading history, that what the Fed is doing now is exactly the same type of thing they did back then, and we had a decade of misery back then, so I don't know why we want to use the same policies that we had back then.
But you also have somebody like David Merkel, who writing and suggesting that that we do not, or not to repeat the mistakes of the Great Depression, feels that, or felt that what the Obamas are doing, the Obama administration is doing, he doesn't entirely agree with, but he believes it's on the right track.
Well, again, it's ironic when people say, let's not repeat the mistakes of the Depression. This is the same thing they did back then. Herbert Hoover has this reputation of being a do-nothing reactionary, but actually, at the time, he was revolutionary, that he ran unprecedented deficits at the time, you know, peacetime deficits. And the Hoover Dam, for example, was a public works program that he started. He had a Reconstruction Finance Corporation to bail out banks. So all the things that we are now being told need to be done to avoid the mistakes of the Depression, Hoover did, and then FDR just came along and multiplied them under the New Deal.
In the Depression, Dr. Murphy, you had unemployment running in the neighborhoods of 20+%. The latest figures out of the United States is somewhere close to 9%, if not 9%. Some suggest it's going to get to 10 or 11% before things stop bleeding and you know, maybe there's a turnaround in that particular area. And this is what some of the economists are saying. If there had not been some kind of action by government, whether little or moderate or, in this instance, quadrupling the government of the United States debt, that you would have had unemployment in the 20s and the 30s, and it would have been there for a long time. You don't buy that?
I don't buy that because I think specifically the reason unemployment got so high under Hoover was right after the stock market crashed. Hoover called in all the executives late 1929 and told them, I want you to keep your wage rates the same, because he thought the worst thing you can do was start cutting workers' pay because then they can't buy the products. And so what happened perversely in the early 1930s is prices were falling because